Remember how I said this would be a two-parter thing and we'd discuss how empires rise and fall in just one video? Well, about that, this is just gonna be on how empires rise, and you'll get a part 3 on how they fall. Hopefully you don't mind. What causes the rise of an empire? Well, you need 1,000 food and 800 gold to start, but that's not the point. Last video, we discussed what makes an empire work, what prevents it from collapsing. Communication, control, and commerce. Link up in the corner to watch. But today, we'll be discussing how our glorious empires rise and, like, how hard could that possibly be to summarize? So, the rise of an empire. Logically, when world building your empire, you have to figure out its shape. Which planets is it centered on? Why does it expand to certain kingdoms but not others? Where are its borders? And what is its primary motivation for empire building? Any number of factors are involved here, but we'll be looking at 3 important forces that lead to different kinds of empires. Resource, security, and nationalism. As before, this video is brought to you at the wonderful suggestion of one of my absolutely amazing patrons who is actually doing his thesis in this kind of stuff, so he helped me write the script. This sort of educational content takes me longer to make than my usual stuff. It takes a whole week, and I love doing it, and it would mean the world if you find this stuff helpful for your writing, if you would help me do that for just a couple of dollars a month on my Patreon. There is a link to that down in the description below. I would love for you to come join our Discord community. It's an amazing little place. We talk about writing and world building all the time. Come join us. I'd like to reiterate the most important thing about world building empires. Study the accounts of real historical empires, why they rose, what sustained them, and why they fell. They will be the best possible education that you can have. This video will raise some important points and questions, but studying real empires is vital to having a realistic foundation to your own fictional one. Firstly, resources. Needing or wanting resources is a major motivation for empire building. Maybe they need food, wood, stone, or
gold, please.
And this setup gives us 2 points of guidance in constructing your empire. Firstly, this gives you a geographical map of where your empire will be trying to exert force. This includes considering the geography and landmass of the homeland itself. Which resources doesn't your homeland have that it needs or wants, and where does have those resources? Portugal wanted valuable dyes, woods, as well as spices that it didn't have access to itself. Where did have all that? Brazil. Secondly, this will help determine the way in which your empire exerts force through resource control. In doing so, it often has an economic backbone. If your fictional world economy runs on a naval trade, then the empire would naturally desire a strong navy, and its strategy would revolve around controlling crucial ports around the world. If your sci-fi world has an emphasis on space trade routes, or there are particular trading planets, then controlling them is crucial for establishing a viable empire that can acquire resources. This is partly why Coruscant in the Star Wars series was so vital to control. It's an important planet at the end of a dozen space trading routes. But on how they go about it? Well, sometimes resource-motivated empires don't rely on overt hostile military invasion. They acquire trade deals, they impose taxes on their exports, tariffs on their imports, and extract to enrich the homeland, even if backed up by
this gun that was lent from the National Rifle Association.
This was, well, partly what Britain was famous for doing in India, New Zealand, Canada, Kenya, and its other colonies. Now, in contrast, your empire's focus could be on eliminating trade it doesn't control. Control of the Silk Road connecting the East and the West was critical to controlling the economy of the Mongolian Empire, but in the early days, Genghis Khan destroyed a number of southern Arabian and Turkish cities to eliminate trade routes that he couldn't easily control. Trade was forced to go through his one Silk Road, ensuring his economic predominance. Now, one underestimated factor in the way an empire expands is climate. The British Empire usually brought legal traditions, courts, and parliament to the places they colonized, but they quickly discovered that the hot climate of Kenya and the other African colonies was intolerable and deadly, with a huge host of diseases that they simply couldn't fight. Realizing this, their focus switched from colonization to extraction, primarily just taking resources to enrich the homeland. Where the people of an empire have no real interest in colonizing a land the empire takes for its resources, they may resort to an extraction strategy, rather than the more amicable strategies we discussed just before. This is often more brutal to those living there, as it doesn't necessarily bring with it the legal structures that citizens would usually be entitled to. This is often caused by how inhospitable the climate or the environment is, like trying to build an empire in the map Arabia. However, this is by no means a universal rule, and it most commonly applies to resource-driven empires, but there are a whole host of other factors that play into how they could treat these lands. One notable factor in considering these 2 points is how big you want the landmass of your empire's homeland to be. Generally, smaller homelands have fewer and less diverse resources, meaning they are more likely to be resource-driven than larger states. Think Great Britain, Portugal, and the Dutch Empire. A world fractured into islands and archipelago like Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea may be more likely to have resource-driven empires arise in it. The Fire Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender is actually a relatively good example of most of this. Their comparatively small size means that resources are a crucial element of their expansion strategy. Their need for the coal, wood, and iron-rich deposits of the northwestern Earth Kingdom determined the shape of the Fire Empire. At the beginning of the war, this area was a priority for them to colonize and control. Beyond this, knowing that the world economy is largely in a naval trade, they built a strong navy and focused on controlling port cities within the Earth Kingdom to manipulate trade and impose taxes that could enrich the homeland. However, there is an inverse version of this, where the homeland controls the majority or monopolizes an extremely valuable resource that other nations require. This helps determine 2 things. The monopoly may help determine the political structure of the empire. A great example of this is how Arrakis in Frank Herbert's Dune is the only place in the universe that has the resource spice, which is described in the fashion that, without it there is no commerce in the empire, there is no civilization, he who controls it controls our destiny. Seriously, it's practically just an empire built on space cocaine. The result of this is that it becomes the capital of the Atreides Empire. The powers that be naturally center around controlling that resource, which has become so valuable. Other powerful factions like the Bene Gesserit and the Guild Navigators of the Spacing Guild also ensure they have representatives on Arrakis, the center of power because of that resource. This monopoly may help determine the shape of the empire, as it is driven to preserve itself against those who would wish to take that precious resource, though we'll get more to this on our part on security. And if you're looking for a unique setup for your story about an empire, then this may be it. It's more often that empires are seen as extractionist, but if the welfare and economy of a homeland is heavily related to the control and trade of a certain resource, then those who control that resource will naturally wield power in any empire that comes from that, either directly in a monarchical feudal sense or indirectly by influencing those in power. It may create a cultural, economic, and political center for the empire, and that setup could be really fascinating to play with as you look into the machinations of those in power controlling this resource and the like. Considering which resources your homeland has and which resources it needs gives shape to an empire by determining where in your fictional universe it will assert its power. It also helps determine how it will go about doing so, by manipulating trade, colonization, or extraction. Ownership and location of these valuable resources within an empire can also affect its political structure. A second major reason that empires form is security. This is both in why certain people groups across an area join together, and in how they acquire new land in the fallout of wars against neighboring kingdoms, states, planets, or galaxies. The early Romans are a great example of both of these. They were a bunch of disconnected villages positioned at a strategic point along the Tiber River. This position attracted the attention from Latins, Sabines, Volscians, and Etruscans. As a result, this collection of villages were forced to band together to form a city-state. So they formed together for security, and after their victories over the Etruscan city of Veii or the neighbouring city of Tusculum, the Romans subsumed their land and incorporated the defeated inhabitants into their state, growing the size of the empire. Some empires establish a foothold in the lands of people who attack them as a security measure to ensure their enemies will not attack them again. This grows your glorious empire. And in the same way that resource-driven empires are given shape by where the resources are, security-based empires are given shape by defensible borders, mountains, canyons, coastlines, or the deep Ardennes forest that no army could possibly Blitzkrieg! An empire may be more motivated by security depending on the geography of their homeland. For example, the Mongolian homeland across the Eurasian steppe lacks a naturally defensible coastline and doesn't have an easily defensible southern border. With the Chinese to the south and the Turks to the west, to secure his homeland, Genghis Khan brought the surrounding nations to heel, to establish more defensible borders, create a secure position for his homeland with a huge buffer zone, as well as prevent the Turks and Chinese from rising against him again. And within this, while a resource empire may more often arise from small nations or islands, large or land-based nations without coastlines, especially those that are landlocked, may often be more driven by security, with less naturally defensible borders. The Britannian Empire in Code Geass is an interesting mix. At its beginning, its shape is determined by a need for security. It conquered its neighbours in the Americas as a means to protect itself and create a more robust resistance to enemy empires around it. But as the rare material Sakuradite became more valuable in the war, it decided to conquer Japan, where it could be found. Empires don't just conquer places randomly, they choose them for specific reasons, here being security or resources. However, people groups don't just unite under a single figurehead for mutual security against external threats, but also internal threats like lawlessness and bandits.
And you're the bandits who have been causing chaos, where I am trying to establish order.
Being a single political entity means that the roads and areas between cities can be more effectively protected and policed, making both travel and trade easier within their borders. And we discussed how commerce leads to prosperity, stability, and peace in an empire last video. It's also no longer up to just one town to deal with those damn wolves murdering my A third major reason for the formation of an empire is nationalism. And before we get into this, I want to remind you that history is complicated! Nationalism is a complex ideology with caveats and different interpretations that mean it would be reductionist to just call it good, bad, evil, or oppressive. It's also thought of as a relatively modern concept, but nationalism in one form or another can be seen all throughout history, even if it wasn't called that. What I mean to say is that we aren't just talking about Nazis, okay? They were nationalists, but they aren't the only nationalists. So, nationalism is a strange creature that can equally arise out of strife and prosperity. The Republic or later Galactic Empire is one example of nationalism that arose out of strife, a galaxy-wide war, economic downturn, and fear of losing their way of life and traditions. The response to this is a nationalistic wave in hopes of a Becoming an empire is seen as a way to prevent that decay. On the other hand, we see how the Fire Nation's nationalism arises out of prosperity.
Our nation is enjoying an unprecedented time of peace and wealth. Our people are happy. We should share this prosperity with the rest of the world. In our hands is the most successful empire in history. It's time we expanded it.
The desire to build an empire doesn't come from fear of loss of the way of life, but out of this righteous belief that their way of life is better, and thus they have a right to spread it across the rest of the world. But nationalism naturally enters the narrative of a story in a curious way that the other forces don't. A desire for resources or security isn't necessarily as personal to your everyday lumberjack villager number 3. It was the Britannian military who needed the resource Sakuradite, and security on the border is usually dealt with by the government. In contrast, nationalism is a force that permeates the mindset of everyday citizens on a very personal level. Now, it's easy to show how nationalistic your empire is through banners everywhere and giant group gatherings that totally aren't the Nuremberg rally, but it can be more effective to show your nationalism through how your characters think. It's their traditions that are dying out, it's their philosophy that is superior, it's their economy that is so much damn better than the states around them. They've got plenty of reserve supplies, luxuries are readily available, and they've already researched looms, so they're practically immortal. This was very much the case when it came to the expansion of the early Islamic caliphates, where they had a strong economy and academic culture that led to revolutions in science and mathematics for the day. But they also had a unifying religion that they believed others should adhere to as well. They had a belief and a duty to spread that to the rest of the world. Nationalism revolves around traditions, philosophies, religions, and ways of life that people value and care about on a deep and personal level. It's important to keep in mind how that can play into their character motivations, their relationships between those who come from that nationalism and those who don't. and societal functions like how they would want their education system to run. This also presents a challenge for writers where they have protagonists who grow up within a possibly racist, sexist, or condescending cultural environment of their empire. Why do they not adhere to this nationalistic ideology or the racist or sexist undertones that come with it when everyone else around them does? Often there isn't a good reason given, they're just inexplicably naturally more moral or intelligent. Avatar: The Last Airbender does a great job of this with Zuko. He did grow up in a nationalistic state, and it takes a difficult and long personal transformation for him to break down those preconceptions and emerge anew. He's not just magically better. But let's talk about the political structure behind nationalism. It's totally understandable to think that nationalism must lead to fascism with recent historical experiences like Hitler and Mussolini and wow, that's a lot of fascist movements. But an absolute fascist leader doesn't necessarily follow a rise in nationalism. Gandhi was one such example of Indian nationalism not leading to fascism. What is true is that because nationalistic movements have incredibly emotional and personal motivations, it does often center around a single leader who embodies and encourages those sentiments. Napoleon was loved by many as someone who championed the values of the French Revolution, while Hitler advocated for German values, which included duty, industry, discipline, law, sovereignty, and order, things they felt they were losing in the wake of World War I. Even so, with or without this absolute figure at the head of government, nationalism does tend to result in a more centralized power structure. In Harry Turtledove's Timeline 191 series, the fascist Freedom Party seized power over waterways, they used economic planning, and they worked to undermine states' rights and their power to create laws in favour of their leaders' central authority. This is a pattern that we see in real fascist states as well, the government wanting to enforce a single law, a single culture, a single way of life in hopes of defending it across the entire state. And that requires local government to have less power to ensure that they cannot undermine that. A nationalistic empire does provide for a slightly different writing opportunity though, with a slightly different focus for the tension in the narrative. Nationalistic empires have an internal focus on creating this single culture and single law for the homeland. What happens to those who are part of the homeland but don't conform? History ranges from expulsion to pogroms to the Holocaust. But how would your empire deal with this internal conflict? It's not just concerned with the colonies or those it conquers. Nationalistic empires often result in fascist governments with a single person at its center, but this is not required. They also usually result in centralized power, but this in turn causes the issues that we discussed around communication and control last video, which can destabilize the empire. A nationalistic empire also allows for a focus more on the citizens of the homeland who do or don't conform, while resource security empires often focus more on the conflict between those in and out of the homeland. Those are three important motivations for empire building, but how do they actually accomplish it? You might want to build an empire, but I'm sorry to break this to you, you need more than just hopes and dreams. Let's talk about one factor to consider: technological advantage, by which I mean those damn elite English longbowmen. The Romans conquered the tribes of Europe with ease through superior military tactics. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople due to a huge technological advantage: cannons that could bring down the usually defensible walls. The British outmatched native groups with muskets. A great fictional example of this is the Fire Nation. With their industrialized economy, steam-powered ships, and mechanized siege weapons, the Earth Kingdom didn't stand a chance. The Galactics in B.V. Eliassin's Steel World brought humanity into its empire under threat of its Hellburner weapons. You know, sci-fi is full of empires who conquer using superior technology rather than tactics. It's often just this boardroom of people going, right, what's our next plan? Our last laser machine was destroyed. I don't know. Hang on, what about a bigger laser? You're just hell of a genius. Give that man a raise. If the focus of your narrative is on the conflict your empire is in, then technological imbalance can be a complicating factor. One example of this is that the expansion of the Rashidun Caliphate was temporarily slowed by the walled cities of the Nile Delta. For a while, they didn't have the siege weapons or technology to easily take those cities on that terrain. In your writing, the question becomes, how does your empire evolve to deal with this, or does it back down? Technological imbalance will help determine the shape of the empire. They will often go to places they can easily take with their superior tech or tactics rather than face down against an enemy who can fight them on equal ground. If your empire has managed to subsume more technologically advanced peoples than itself, then the reader may wonder why. So, what have we discussed today? Firstly, empires are often driven by resources. Where certain resources are found determines where they can expand to, the type of economy helps determine how they do so, and climate and geography of the homeland are both factors to consider. Controlling a valuable resource may also give a natural center to the empire. Secondly, empires are often driven by security and uniting their people or taking over enemy lands to protect themselves. Defensible borders, buffer zones for the homeland, and strategic points of control may help determine where their empire expands to. These are often more land-based or landlocked than islands. It is also a measure of ensuring internal security. Thirdly, empires are often driven by nationalism in the wake of strife or prosperity. It's important to show this mentality in the minds of everyday citizens, and this presents a challenge for a protagonist who grew up with it, and it may more easily allow for a narrative that focuses on internal tensions. It often results in fascism, but it does not need to. Fourthly, empires nearly always have a tactical or technological advantage against those that they absorb. But that is part 2, and I'll be back with a discussion around why your empire failed later in the week. If you'd like to support this channel and the educational content that it makes, then I would love for you to come support me over on Patreon for just a couple of dollars a month. Join our Discord server, we discuss world building and writing all the time. I would love to have you there. Question of the day, which historical leader would you prefer to be ruled by? Let me know why down in the comments below. I'm partial to maybe John F. Kennedy. I reckon he'd be an okay dictator. You know, what you can do for your empire, not what you can do for the you. In the meantime, come follow me over on Twitter, Facebook, email me stuff that you may enjoy, some links in the description below. Stay nerdy, sub-furious, and I will see you in the future.